By the time he was 23, Gyeongheo Sang-woo was recognized as one of the most brilliant scholars in Korea, a man who had navigated the most dense and difficult classical texts of his era. He was a product of his time. Late 19th century Korean Buddhism had largely abandoned the difficult physical practice of meditation. In its place was a culture of dry academic study, monks who could recite the sutras from memory but rarely experience them. Gyeongheo sat at the peak of this intellectual hierarchy. He presided over hundreds of students at Gyeongheo Temple, living a life of prestige and safety within walls built of words. This mastery created a dangerous sense of security. On paper, Gyeongheo understood the nature of suffering and the transience of life, but his knowledge remained abstract, a map of a country he had never actually visited. In 1879, Gyeongheo's map failed him. While traveling to visit a former teacher, he was caught in a violent rainstorm. Drenched and shivering, he sought shelter in a small village, knocking on doors for a place to stay. He found only silence. Pushing open a door, he discovered a house full of rotting corpses. He stepped back into the street and saw the sign. The village had been devastated by a cholera epidemic. Gyeongheo realized he was standing in a graveyard. For all his years of study, he found himself paralyzed by raw, physical terror. The thousands of pages he had mastered offered no comfort against the reality of his own death. This confrontation left him with a devastating insight. If his decades of learning could not help him face a virus, then his life's work was essentially meaningless. He was a master of ghosts, and for the first time, he was alone with his fear. Gyeongheo fled back to his temple, but he didn't return to his lectern. He gathered his students and dismissed them all, saying he was unfit to teach. He claimed that the sutras were merely the Buddha's footprints, not the Buddha's mind. He had spent his life following the tracks, but he had never met the tiger. He locked himself in a small room and made a vow. He would not step back into the world until he resolved the question of life and death that had terrified him in the village. To fight off the pull of sleep, he used pain as an anchor. He sat with a sharp knife held under his chin, and whenever his head began to drop, he would drive a shoemaker's awl into his own thigh. He had stripped away his title, his students, and his comfort. In that room, his survival depended on an internal friction, a grinding effort to move past his own logic and find something that could not be shaken by mortality. He focused his entire being on a hadu, a riddle to bypass the intellect, working against the pressure of his own logic. 3 months later, a student mentioned a layman's joke. If the monk was reborn as a cow, he would be a cow with no nostrils. This held a specific logic. A cow with no nostrils cannot be pierced by a ring. Without a ring, there is no rope. And without a rope, the animal can never be tied, pulled, or controlled. The realization hit Gyeongheo with the force of an avalanche. The boundary between his internal logic and the outside world vanished. He stood up and walked out of the room, later writing that he finally understood the whole universe was his home. The shift was more than an epiphany. By letting go of the internal structure he used to categorize reality, he found that the terror he felt in the cholera village had simply ceased to exist. The man who walked out of that room was no longer the dignified scholar. He became a figure of wild, unpredictable behavior, moving through society with a complete disregard for tradition or expectation. His methods became legendary for their shock value. Once, he suddenly grabbed and kissed a young woman in a village, intentionally inciting a mob of angry villagers to chase him and his exhausted student. The student, fueled by adrenaline, ran for miles, suddenly finding a strength he didn't know he possessed. He preached naked to challenge his mother's attachments, and later spent a week sharing a bed with a contagious leper. These weren't stunts. They were expressions of a mind that no longer recognized the barriers of disgust or social standing. In Gyeongheo's world, the rules of polite society were revealed as just another form of the rope and ring. Without them, his actions were guided by a direct, unhindered response to the moment. This mad monk transformed the landscape of his religion. He is credited with reviving the experiential core of Korean Zen Buddhism, bringing life back to a tradition that had almost become a museum. His students became the architects of modern Korean Zen. They carried his emphasis on direct experience into the foundations of the Gyeongheo order, which remains the dominant Buddhist school in Korea today. In 1905, Gyeongheo performed his final act of detachment. He abandoned his status and fame to vanish into the northern mountains. He spent his final years incognito, living as a simple layman among the poor. His identity finally merged with the world around him. Gyeongheo's story suggests that the most profound wisdom is not a collection of answers, but a state of being, the fearless, unhindered life of a cow with no nostrils.